today. So welcome to the Asheville City Council budget work session. And I assume tech people, you'd tell me to stop talking if we weren't good. We're good, I assume. Good, thank you, thumbs up. This is another budget work session today. And Deborah, do you want me to go to you and we'll go to Tony? Okay, all right, we're going to hear from Tony McDowell with the very long title of Finance and Management Services Director to begin this budget work session. And again, folks who are watching, there are no votes taken during work sessions. This is an information session, opportunity to learn, and for the council to ask questions. So go ahead,
Right.
Take it away.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Mayor and City Council. Welcome to the second budget work session of the season. I think I'm getting this just right. So we're going to run through some slides today. I'm going to do some of the presentation. Taylor Floyd, Budget Manager, is also going to help out as well. And then we've got a few slides at the end on the Memorial Stadium project, and Jay Dundas, our Capital Projects Director, will cover those. So I'll go ahead and jump in. So the presentation overview today, really today we're going to be focused on following up from previous meetings on some items that were discussed there. We're going to spend a little bit of time kind of doing a deep dive into our fund balance. City Council had some questions at the retreat about fund balance usage this year and just kind of fund balance in general. So we want to give you all a kind of, like I said, a deep dive into that today. We're also going to talk about staffing costs and budgeting. Again, the issue that was raised at the council retreat about where we're at with our staffing budgets for this year and salary savings given all the vacancies that we have. We're also going to touch briefly on proposed fees and charges. Those went to the Finance Committee in March and are scheduled to come to you all in a couple weeks for your final vote. So we're just going to kind of quickly review some of the information that we shared with the Finance Committee a few weeks ago. And then the final piece of the budget discussion today will be talking about the parking and transit funds. Typically at these second budget work sessions, we usually focus on enterprise funds. And that's kind of what we're doing today. We're not going to cover water and stormwater and some of the other funds simply because we really don't have a whole lot to update at this point, but we do on parking and transit, and we've talked to you all a little bit at some of the previous meetings about those as well. And then finally, like I mentioned, Jay Dundas is going to give you all an update on the proposed funding for the Memorial Stadium project. So as we always do, we like to highlight some key takeaways at the beginning of the presentation. And really some of these things are really things that we have hit upon at our previous presentations that we did for you all back in February and then also the council retreat. And that is that the lingering impacts of the pandemic have created some budget challenges for us this year, particularly in terms of inflation and price volatility. And we're looking at inflation not only in terms of prices for materials and goods, but also for fuel, for labor. There's the labor market increases. There's a large increase in the percentage around pay for employees year over year. And then it's also created some new service needs and some demands on our services. For example, in the areas of cleanliness, providing services for our houseless population and other areas as well. And then as we highlighted at our previous meetings as well, we do have a limited capacity despite some good revenue growth. Because of all the needs and the inflation, we do have limited capacity at this point to fund new or expanded services next year. So before we kind of jump into the fund balance look, we just wanted to kind of highlight where we're at in the process. As I said, we've had one work session already. You all also had your council retreat a few weeks ago. This is the second work session. We'll be coming back to you all in 2 weeks for another work session. Also at that formal meeting that night, you'll be adopting the fees and charges for FY 22-23. And then we're a little over a month, probably about 6 weeks away from bringing you the manager's proposed budget, and then finally moving toward budget adoption, public hearing and budget adoption in June. So just to briefly kind of look back and summarize some of the things that were talked about at the previous meeting. So at the February 22nd work session, we really talked to you all a lot, and Taylor Floyd covered this, about how this year's budget process is really a continuation of the work that we started a couple of years ago, and particularly in focusing on our services in a comprehensive fashion, as opposed to looking at them at a department level, looking at things through an equity lens, working with the community. And so all those themes we're continuing this year with our budget work, and will continue on past June as well. We also shared with you all that the overall financial position for the current year is strong. We've had good growth in our sales tax revenues this year, and we have a positive outlook for next year as well. And then finally, you heard from Jay Dundas, our capital projects director, on some of our capital needs and the work being done there to prioritize those needs and identify a funding strategy for them. And then we talked to you all a couple weeks ago at the council retreat and gave you all an economic overview. And so just kind of a quick summary of some of the things we talked about there. Again, overall positive economic outlook, and it's reflected in our projected general fund revenue growth for next year. As I mentioned already, we're seeing some pretty significant inflationary pressures that's impacting our ability to deliver services and also to our ability to fund new and expanded services as well. And then you also heard from Walter Ear in our capital projects department about the data-driven approach that we're taking to looking at our facilities and kind of mapping out the where we want to go with our long-term investments in facilities. And then kind of most importantly at the council retreat, you all worked to identify your priorities for next year. And I won't name these and go through them, but this is what really provides us with our blueprint as we work through the rest of the budget process. Look at requests from departments, look at where we do have the capacity to fund services or programs, and we really go back to this and we try and map out the new spending to align with council's priorities for the coming year. Got too many gadgets here I'm trying to keep up with. So with that, I'll kind of go into fund balance, and I'll take a quick drink of water before I do that. So like I said, at the council retreat, we had some questions around fund balance. In particular, have we used any fund balance this year? What are our fund balance levels at? How do we compare to other cities? And so we pulled together some information to share with you all today. So to just kind of start with a definition of fund balance, and we're really talking about what we call available or unassigned fund balance here, and I'll just kind of read this definition. It's from School of Government. It's money that's left at the end of one fiscal year that can be appropriated to finance expenditures in the next year's budget. Second bullet point there, the fund balance, you have to actually look at our annual comprehensive financial report to see our fund balance. We put numbers in our budget document where we do estimates every year, but if you want to see the actual numbers for our fund balance, you have to look in our annual comprehensive financial reports. I think as you all know, we've mentioned to you all on many occasions that the North Carolina Local Government Commission sets a minimum level for fund balance for local governments in North Carolina, and that's 8%, and that we at the City of Asheville have an internal policy to maintain a fund balance of 15%. So why is fund balance important?
May I ask you a question real quick?
Yeah, absolutely.
Sorry. Internal policy, meaning council set that policy or staff?
Yeah, that's a council adopted policy. It's part of our overall set of financial policies that you all adopt.
Thank you.
So why is fund balance important? For several reasons. One is cash flow management. Our primary revenue source in the general fund is property taxes. We get most of that revenue in December or January each year. And so by keeping a fund balance at a certain level allows us to absorb the ups and downs of the cash flow throughout the year. It's also a key measure of fiscal health. In fact, I would say it's probably the most important measure of fiscal health for a local government. And one of the reasons it is so important is that it's a main factor in determining our credit rating. So whenever we go out and borrow money and talk to the debt rating agencies or talk to the local government commission, one of the first things they look at and talk to us about in finance is our fund balance levels and kind of how we're trending in fund balance. It also provides financial resources to weather unexpected crises. And so in that area, so I'll give you all an example. So the city of Wilmington, you'll see some data from them in a couple slides. They typically keep a higher fund balance than most other cities in North Carolina because being on the coast and being susceptible to hurricanes, oftentimes they'll have to dip into their fund balance to cover expenses associated with the hurricane prior to getting a FEMA reimbursement. So having a good, healthy fund balance on hand is very helpful to weather those kind of crises. So in terms of usage of fund balance, again, this was something that was discussed at the retreat a few weeks ago. So fund balance can only be appropriated by city council at either budget adoption or as a budget amendment during the fiscal year. And we haven't done any budget amendments this fiscal year in the general fund, so there hasn't been any fund balance appropriated since the adoption of the budget this year. One thing I will say is, and it's, we kind of, the second bullet, we have used in parentheses there, or in quotations, because fund balance can go up and down, obviously, during the course of a year or year over year. If you have a year where your actual expenses exceed your revenues, then fund balance is going to go down. So it wouldn't have been a council appropriation of fund balance necessarily, but you may see your fund balance go up or down, just simply based on how our revenues and expenses are doing. Okay, so this next chart gives you all a snapshot of where we have been over the last 10 years with our unassigned fund balance. And as I said, we have a policy of maintaining a 15% fund balance. And so we, in working with council and working with the city manager and finance, we try to manage our budgets and our finances in such a way that we kind of maintain our fund balance at a level somewhere between 15 and 20%. And I'm happy to say we've been really successful at doing that over the last 10 years. You all can see we've had a couple of years where we came in pretty much right at 15%. We've had a year we were at 18, 19. But in general, we've maintained our fund balance in a very narrow range between 15 and 20%. I think if you all are looking at this and wondering, well, when should I be concerned, or when should I ask questions about fund balance? I think if we were to show you all this chart and you were to see that trend line going up and continually going up over several years, that probably means we're underestimating our revenues, and it probably means there's additional money that's available to be appropriated and used for one-time services. But again, we're not seeing that. Another area of concern would be if you saw the line continually going down, which would indicate that we're likely living beyond our means and adopting higher revenue estimates than we should, and that revenues aren't coming in to support the expenditures that we have in our budget. So, but again, our history shows a very even and continuous management of the fund balance between 15 and 20%.
May I ask a question?
Sure.
And I'm guessing the red lights don't always come on anymore, so heads up. Just a quick question. I wasn't on council fiscal year of 1920. The 19.3 to 14.5, did council take action during a budget cycle, or was it, like, how does anybody recall the decision there? Did we create a budget that dropped our fund balance, or was it mid-year decisions?
No, it was. There wasn't a usage of fund balance that the council approved that year. There was some, that was, again, kind of going back to the other slide, it's kind of how revenues and expenses came in during the year. There's some other factors that affect our unassigned fund balance too, in terms of how many contracts we have outstanding and things like that we have to reserve against fund balance. And so we may have had a year that year where we had a large amount of those items as well. Generally those kinds of things. And I don't usually go into those because usually they stay kind of constant year after year, but it's possible that you can have a large amount of contracts in one year that can kind of go up, and you have to reserve more of your fund balance for that. But we can check and see exactly what happened in that year. Okay, so the last chart kind of gave you all our history in terms of where we have been with our fund balance over the last 10 years. This chart shows some comparative data with other cities in North Carolina. So we've got 4 columns here. The first is the actual amount of unassigned fund balance that each city has at the end of last fiscal year. The second column is their general fund expenses. Third column is their fund balance percent at the end of fiscal year 21. And then the final column is their policy. So what I would highlight here for you all is obviously there's
Tony,
a...
can I ask you, the expenses, is that the general operating fund? Is that
That's the general fund, yes, ma'am.
and so that was in 21 of 124 million for us. Is that what it would mean for us?
That's correct.
Okay.
Thank you. I'm still learning.
All questions are welcome. So as I was saying, you can see there's quite a range in terms of policy, that final column there. Greensboro maintains a policy of 9%, Concord at 30 to 35. And again, you can kind of see Wilmington down near the bottom there. They try to keep somewhere between 20 and 25% in their unassigned fund balance. I think the next thing you'd probably want to notice is where are those cities at actually in terms of their policies. And you can see there, again, quite a variation. I mean, Greensboro is right at where its policy level is at, so is Asheville, so is Charlotte, I believe. But then you do have some cities that are well above their policy level, places like Concord, again, Wilmington, Durham, some of those cities are well above their levels. And some of that relates to the cities have performed, finances have performed much better for some cities in over the last few years as a part of COVID as revenues have come in. So that might explain some of that, so.
This confuses me forever and ever since I've been doing this, because, you know, to me, you want to have a fund balance that serves the purpose of a fund balance, which is kind of like a savings account, and in case of emergency or whatever, but it's this cushion you've got to have. But also so you can achieve the best bond rating. And I've always learned, you know, when I was a student, that if your fund balance was too high, you were probably not funding your projects correctly. You probably should be looking at, I don't know, debt finance or something else that you had the capacity to do that you weren't doing. And I just wonder if there are, you know, I mean, how are you supposed to determine what is the best policy for a fund balance? I mean, I'm looking at this and I know that Concord, for example, has a similar population to Asheville. And, you know, look at that fund balance. They're trying to have a 50%, they have a 50% fund balance. I mean, you know, and Wilmington is kind of a sister city to us in the sense that they're similar size, and they also have a somewhat tourist-based economy in part. So I just, you know, I look at that and I wonder, are we doing it right, or are they doing it wrong, or is there not a right or wrong, or, I mean, how do you explain this?
Great question. I think that the last thing you said really is the story. There isn't a right or wrong. I think it's what each community is comfortable with, what their council is comfortable with. Again, I think like a Wilmington, a city like that does have a lot of risk when it comes to natural disaster. I understand why they have theirs higher. A city like Concord, I don't understand that one quite as much. I mean, they're a suburb of Charlotte. They're not a city that, again, has a lot of the kind of, it's more of a bedroom community, so they don't have a lot of the issues that you would think of a large city having, even a city similar to the size of Asheville. So, which it just may be that that provides them with the ability to have a higher level of fund balance. So, but yeah, I think clearly the one takeaway from this chart is, or one of the takeaways is that there isn't a one-size-fits-all policy for each community, so.
Tony, do you ever look at some of those cities and by other departments, like how much is spent on their transit, or how much is, just to do apples to apples, and how some of these cities that are able to save more are spending?
Yeah, we haven't really done that kind of deep dive. I know, you know, some of the cities on this list are, and I think High Point and maybe Jacksonville are what's called electric cities. So they run their own electric utility, which often those cities tend to have kind of different, and they're set up as enterprise funds. And so they have kind of a different financial structure. And you often see them with a higher level of fund balance than you do some of these other places, so.
And Mayor, if I could, and the reason that we actually wanted to show this chart is because, as Tony said, you know, state requires, LGC requires that there be a fund balance, and that's at 8%. And essentially what this chart is trying to demonstrate is that these cities, obviously, they have adopted their own policies. There's a lot of differentiation between what the actual policy is and the percent of their fund balance. We feel that if you're close to your policy, then you are generally managing your resources appropriately. If you're way above, that's an issue. If you're way below, that should be an issue. But when you are managing, you know, a couple of percentage points either above or below, that's probably good accounting. I mean, that's good financial management, and that's really the reason for the chart. And why we wanted to show that history is there isn't a whole lot of way above or way below our adopted policy.
Yeah, exactly. Any other questions on either of the previous two charts?
This is Gwen.
Oh. That scared me.
Gwen, we're introducing your blank spot that's now speaking. That Gwen is still quarantining with just at the very end of her COVID exposure. So, Gwen, please ask a question.
Thank you. Tony, what's the ramification if we would go below 8%? And do we have any, that's so funny, it's showing my MTC right now. What's the ramification if we were to go below 8%? And are there any examples of that you know of?
You mean you're 15% for we're on the general fund?
No, I mean 8%. I mean the 15% is just a policy of ours, and we'd have to just deal with that. But if you went below 8%, which is what I believe the state requires.
Correct.
Yeah, and so good question. So there are some smaller local governments in North Carolina that have gone under and are under 8% right now. I was on a call with Local Government Commission last fall, and there was a entity that was reporting out. I can't remember who it was. It was a small city on the coast who had like a 3% fund balance, and so that does happen. The LGC, if you get even close to 8%, the LGC will send you a letter. And we actually got a letter soon after I started in 1999 or 2000 here at the city. We were down to 10%, and we got a letter from the LGC saying, "Hey, y'all getting close. You know, what are you going to do to rectify the situation?" And so if you go below 8%, obviously it's going to affect your debt rating. It's probably going to affect your debt rating even before you get that low. And then at some point, the LGC would stop you from allowing you to issue debt. If you reach that level. And then, of course, if you continued on down, then the LGC does have the power to step in and actually manage your finances if things got really, really bad. So does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. Any additional questions? I'm going to move on to the next slide. So showed you all history so far. We ended fiscal year 21 at 18.1 million. In terms of fund balance. So this is kind of where we think we're going to land this year. And it's even though we're late, feels like we're late in the fiscal year, it's still early when you're making these kinds of estimates, probably because some of our revenue comes in very late in the year. Sales taxes are 3 months behind. But where we think we're headed this fiscal year is, again, we think revenues are going to exceed expenses, and we're going to add some money to our fund balance. We think right now we're going to end up the year somewhere around 21.3 million. So, but when you look at that on a percentage basis, we're still going to be right around 15%. And I think the reason for that is if you do the math here, it's you take that 21.3 million and you divide it by expenses. And so, as the mayor pointed out, our expenses in the previous slide were 120 some million, I believe, last year. We do think they're going to be up a fair amount this year. A lot of that relates to the adjustments that we made at the start of the budget year this year with the salary increases and the compensation adjustments and that kind of thing. So we are seeing expenses trend higher this year, coming in right around our 15% target again this year. And then, so just kind of a quick summary, and then if you all have any additional questions, I'd be happy to answer those about fund balance. So again, it's a key metric of financial health, if not the most important measure. It's a point-in-time calculation. I don't think I mentioned this earlier, but when our auditors come in and calculate our fund balance every year, they do it as of June 30th. And so it's done at that date at the end of each fiscal year. It grows and increases every year in general if our revenues exceed expenses, although, like I said, there's some other things that go into the calculation as well. And then if council and staff are looking to appropriate in our fund balance, it should only be used for one-time expenses. Again, it's a one-time revenue source. If you want to take money out of fund balance, it really should be used only for one-time expenses and not to fund ongoing programs or services. So I will pause there and see if you all have any additional questions on fund balance.
Tony, this is Gwen. Is it okay to talk? Okay. So when we are needed to look at our fund balance and look at our prospective expenses, or is it always looking backwards? Just when you're developing a budget?
So you could do it either way. And actually, as we were doing some of the research for this presentation and looking at the other policies that other cities have, some cities base the calculation off of where they ended the prior year, so the actuals of the prior year. Some base it off of their newly adopted budget, which in many ways is a more conservative way of doing it because generally your budgets are going to go up year to year. So I guess the short answer is you can do it either way.
How do we do it?
So another good question. So we have done it, we have looked at it through both lenses in the past. Currently, when we talk about fund balance with you all, we're talking about it as a percent of prior year expenses or current year expenses. So for example, if I'm talking to you all about fund balance right now and I'm saying it's going to come in at 15% this year, I'm basing it off of that current year estimated expenses, not looking at what next year's budget is going to be.
So I have a question. What if we don't spend what we had intended to or budgeted to, and we have a surplus? What then happens if we have extra on top of what we had a policy at 15%? Let's say that we had 19% this year.
That's really up to council and the manager to make decisions about how fund balance would be used. Some cities do have policies that dictate kind of how that extra fund balance gets used. Some cities allocate it. So anything above, let's say 15% goes toward capital or gets set aside for capital or something like that. So some cities do have that written into their policies. We don't have that, so it's kind of up to you all's discretion.
So I understand that as a generality, and yet in our February meeting for the Public Safety Committee, we were presented the purchase of a mobile command vehicle that the overall cost was $1,061,000. And my understanding is it wasn't going to come to council for a decision because we had already approved the general budget for that department. I would have expected if we had a surplus that would come back to council for reconsideration.
Yeah, and I'm trying to refresh my memory on that. I don't believe, so the money that was utilized to purchase that vehicle, if I'm remembering correctly, was money that was already budgeted in kind of our general, we have I think it's around $3 million budget every year that we use to replace vehicles. And that money that was used to pay for that particular vehicle came out of that pot of money. So it wasn't surplus or unbudgeted money. It was money that was already budgeted in our capital program for vehicles.
Okay, so my expectation would be if we budgeted to purchase specific vehicles and then made a change, that we would know before the change had been made, not after. And I see that we may have a deeper response here. This is just one example. Another is, I wonder if we hadn't had the $800,000 mistake in not accepting parking funds, would we have a surplus in the transit budget? And if so, how would we allocate that?
I mean, I think what I'm hearing is kind of more of a general question around budgeting. So when we approve a budget for the whole coming year, there's buckets of things that we approve. And if you're moving stuff around in a bucket, it doesn't come back to council for consideration. And in some cases, it's not even all determined at the time we pass the budget. It's just identified as a bucket, so to speak.
Yeah, that's correct. And that's very true about our vehicle replacement budget because our fleet manager works with the departments to determine what the highest needs are. And a lot of that work sometimes happens after those budgets have been adopted. Scott, anything you want to add?
I certainly appreciate that we made the decision that we did. However, I would have just expected to find out about it before we made a change internally in the budget instead of after, as a general
Well,
rule.
maybe that's because staff is doing things all the time with the resources that have been voted on, and it
Correct.
does not come to council. What would rise to the level of, I mean, we do have budget amendments on our agenda from time to time. What does require council action throughout the year?
Yeah, so any action that we take to increase the overall budget of a fund, so for example, if we got in additional revenue, like for example, grant revenue that was not budgeted, we would come back to you all and do a budget amendment for that. Or if we wanted to appropriate fund balance, like I mentioned earlier, we'd come back to you all for that as well. But simply moving money between, let's say, line items in the budget, that does not come to city council for approval.
And,
What-
well, just to follow up on that, what if we're transferring funds that were, in one bucket to another bucket? I mean,
Yeah.
would that require our action?
It would if, let's say, for example, you wanted to, and enterprise funds are so limited anyway, but let's say you wanted to transfer some additional money in a prior year when things were going really well in parking, you said, hey, I want to transfer more money from parking to transit. That would have required, because you're going between funds, so anytime that happens, we have to come to you all for approval.
So if we had remaining funds available from not serving the S3 and S6 routes or the evening routes, we could have said we wanted to move that to something like staff retention in the transportation department, but we just don't have those funds available. But we never would have made that decision internally because the transportation budget had already been generally approved.
Yeah, money could be moved within the transit fund, that's correct, to cover that. So, and we've actually, when Taylor gets up here in a few minutes, we've got some really detailed information on kind of where we're at with the transit fund this year, so.
So, but in general, within funds where we have a shortage or we have additional funds, staff is able to make decisions about where to reallocate funds within, within that service area, and it doesn't require council decision. Yeah, I mean, that is kind of tricky. I mean, if you have a priority about something and you're a council member, but yet staff is, month to month dealing with the flow of revenue within the department and reallocating resources, they're making those decisions under the manager's management.
Yeah, just in general, I've found surprised that any $1 million allocation would be made after the decision before it was at least known by this body.
Say more what you mean about that, because you're saying there's $3 million that was already allocated for vehicle purchases. So this was a vehicle purchase.
Correct.
What would you, because normally what are you thinking about in terms of how we would review
So
a vehicle
we can get into the
purchase?
details of this. I was speaking in generally about when something rise to the level of reconsideration or at least just information. When we were presented it in the February Public Safety Committee, the way that I heard it was when I asked about why we wouldn't pursue some sort of hybrid vehicle to help us get in line with our goals. The answer, the way I heard it, was that we had already purchased the vehicle. This was for information that we had already purchased it. And I would have expected that we would have heard information about purchasing $1 million vehicle before we had made that decision.
So,
Mayor, if I could
but,
get
yeah, and,
for the
well, and
explanation.
I think we would have to make staff aware that we want to know those kinds of things, because we as a council voted on a budget that included $3 million for vehicle acquisition. So so you fill in the gaps, but it sounds like, you did push out information about it, but it technically doesn't come to us for a vote. But you're saying I value hearing about those kinds of major purchase decisions before they happen.
Especially if it goes against our goals to get to a renewable energy.
Could I get the chief to respond to some of the questions that were asked?
Absolutely. Just to provide further background information on that specific purchase. So that was an opportunity that came up quickly, and it was important to Ms. Campbell that council was informed as soon as possible, and so that was placed on the next Public Safety Committee meeting that we were able to have. In relation to how vehicles are purchased, our fleet manager keeps sustainability and those types of purchases at the forefront of those operations. And so when there's opportunities to do that, that is one of the first lens working with our Office of Sustainability.
And I appreciate the specificities around this, and also the need was articulated in the Public Safety Committee, and I appreciate that. What I'm talking about in general here is when we have that big of a change, I was surprised that it wouldn't come to council for reconsideration.
I think the issue maybe is terminology of change. There wasn't necessarily a change. There was an allocation that was made for fleet, and I hope that you all would trust that we could make decisions about what our needs are over the year and what critical paths are for our use. And we had a very, very unique opportunity to get a mobile command vehicle. And at the time, did say, I want to at least inform the Public Safety Committee that we were making that purchase.
As a parallel, recently, within the last couple of years, we had an identified need to replace several of our fire engines, and that was identified by the department as well as our fleet manager as the biggest, highest need. After the budget was adopted, we had one of our ladder trucks go down, and so that need shifted quickly, and we needed to rather than replace fire engines, which was our original plan, we used those same funds that had already been adopted by budget to flex and pivot quickly. This is a very similar situation. We had an identified need that became a reality quickly, and because of that chassis availability, we had to move quickly, and we certainly wanted to get that in front of council as quickly as possible.
Thank you. And speaking back on the generalities, I still have concerns when we find out when the mistake with the parking or the equipment failure with the parking happened at $800,000 of a mistake. So these two are examples that tell me, like, we need to do a deeper dive and dig in, because if big changes are happening, I know we're understaffed and overworked, and it feels a responsibility, or at least I feel a responsibility as a council member, to understand more fully when there's going to be significant changes.
I guess my question, I think Mr. Roney's done. My question was going to be about 10 minutes ago about what happens when we go over budget. Does it trigger council action, or is that when the fund balance might be called, or?
So yeah, if we were on track to overspend a budget in a fund, we monitor that. We would come to you all
Okay.
well before June 30th, because you all would have to take action.
We
If
would have
not,
to
we
act.
would get cited by our auditors for allowing
Okay.
a fund to go over budget.
And then to what Ms. Roney was saying about the faulty equipment with the parking decks, I don't know what practices are that we have, but I would have liked to have known that we were seeing a significant loss of revenue for an extended period of time that was going to impact services or potentially general fund use. So do we have any policies about that, like losing $800,000 to equipment? Is there a point at which we would be notified?
Nothing written into our policies regarding that, no.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, well, if there's no additional questions, I'll move on to the next section of the presentation, and we call this staffing and personnel costs. And again, this relates back to some of the questions that we had at the retreat from council, and also questions about how we budget for personnel costs that came up last year as well. So just a couple quick slides to introduce this topic. And so, when we talk about personnel costs, salary, wages, and benefits, most people I think understand what that is, but we just wanted to put on a slide exactly what that all entails. It includes not just paying people their regular salaries, but it includes overtime. It includes a number of benefits that the city pays as an employer. The retirement system is a large one, and really the largest one on that right-hand side of the chart is the amount the city puts into our health, the employee health, dental, and life insurance program. But that's kind of a comprehensive look at all of the various salary and wage and benefit categories that we have here at the city. So why are salaries important? Well, I think we've talked to you all a number of times about this, that being a service-driven organization, our budgets are heavily personnel intensive. In fact, the general fund budget is about 61% personnel costs. And it's important because, again, it's people providing services, and it's important that we provide our employees with pay that allows us to be, and benefits that allow us to be an employer of choice, so that we can continue to recruit and retain employees as well. So just a little bit on how we budget salaries. Again, we talked a little bit about this during last year's budget process as well, because council had some questions, primarily because we have been having a higher level of turnover and more vacancies in the last few years with some of the shifts in the labor market. We don't and never have budgeted 100% of salaries, so we always know that there's going to be vacancies throughout the year. So when we're crafting the budget in the general fund, we assume a certain level of vacancies for most departments. We do budget fully the fire department just because of their minimum staffing requirements. Even when they do have vacancies, that salary savings usually gets used to pay overtime for folks coming in. Some of our smaller departments, like the city attorney's office, we usually budget those at 100% of salaries as well. But in general, we budget most departments with an assumed vacancy rate, and we don't have that number on this slide. I think it's on the next one, but we usually assume a 1.5% salary vacancy rate. So in other words, we budget salaries at 98.5%, not at 100%. Just a couple other things we do throughout the budget process. Obviously, when we're doing budgets every year, there's a lot of positions each year that are vacant when we're doing the budget, and so we try and provide a little bit of flexibility there, and so some vacant positions we will budget at 20% above the minimum pay, which allows departments some flexibility when they make offers. And then we budget our overtime, our temp seasonal, and some other pays like that on a kind of a historical trend basis. So we'll look at what departments and how departments have been spending over the last few years and set those budgets based on that. So in the current year budget, we did a couple things differently than what we normally do. And I just want to kind of talk quickly about those. So I think the biggest one was in the Asheville Police Department. As you all know, with the turnover in that department, we've been down a number of positions. So we assumed that they would, throughout this fiscal year, carry at least 50 vacancies. And again, that's something we haven't done in the past, assumed that level of attrition in the police department. But we did utilize those savings. So those savings didn't just kind of roll back into the budget or weren't unused. We utilized those savings to cover the cost and reinvest in the police department and cover the cost of their compensation study and also some additional overtime for that department and some other costs this year as well. We did increase, again, because we knew that there was going to be a higher level of vacancies throughout the year. Instead of using that 1.5% vacancy assumption, we upped that to 1.75% this year and are planning on continuing that next year as well. And then, as you all know, we were looking at a lot of adjustments last year through the class and compensation study, and we estimated that impact, and you all adopted a budget around that, around those numbers. And we've still continued to refine some of those numbers as we've gone through the year, and I'll have a couple of examples of that in a few slides here. So where does that leave us this year? And I'm going to kind of skip to that bottom line. We have some history, and I'll talk about that as well. But where we're at right now, and we looked, budget staff looked at expenses to date this year through our last payroll that was run a couple weeks ago, trended that out through the rest of this fiscal year. And again, this is just general fund, it's just salaries. But on that last line there, you can see we have a budget of about $61.5 million. We actually think we're going to come in pretty much right at budget on salaries, maybe just a little bit over. And again, on the next slide, I'll kind of talk about some of those reasons why we think we may be headed a little over budget. But I did want to talk just a little bit about the history as well. And I think this, again, kind of speaks to our approach to budgeting salaries and kind of the accuracy of that. And you can see that, obviously in a large budget, your dollar variances are going to be fairly large sometimes, even if your percentages aren't. So you can see in most years, we are landing somewhere between 98 to 100, 101% of budget. So we have been right on with our salary budgets the last few years. FY21 was a little bit different. As you all know, there was a higher level of vacancies in the police department. We also utilized some CARES Act money in that fiscal year to cover some of our salary expenses that would have normally hit the general fund. So that variance last fiscal year was a little bit higher than what we normally see. So again, just what are some of the things that are kind of driving salary expenses in the current fiscal year? We made a number of adjustments with the budget adoption in the Asheville Fire Department. After doing some analysis and working with the chief, there were some additional adjustments that were made afterwards to address some pay inequities that were occurring. We've also discovered that some of our initial estimates for the additional costs for some of the additional holidays and the family leave were a little bit under what we thought they would be. So there's the overtime costs in AFD are a little bit higher. And then we've added some APD overtime expenses to help maintain minimum staffing. Obviously, they've still been down a number of sworn positions, and also to provide some security at city-sponsored events and just as some incentives to encourage officers to come in and work overtime. And we've also made some adjustments in other departments as well on a case-by-case basis as we've discovered that some of the results of the compensation study led to some additional adjustments that were needed. So then kind of pivoting into next year, and then I'll summarize and be happy to take any questions on this. So what are some of the things we're looking at next year in terms of things that are going to impact our salary and benefit budget? And we talked a little bit about some of these already with you all, but the state is requiring all local governments to put more money into the retirement system next year. This is, I think, going to be the 4th or 5th year in a row that they've required that. That's our estimate of how much it's going to impact the general fund next year. We also, this year I mentioned we budgeted 50 vacant positions in the police department. We know with the intentional efforts that the police department is taking with the recruitment firm to begin to hire new employees and bring more folks on board, that we're not going to be able to budget that level of vacancies next year. They're going to have more folks on board, so we're going to have to up their salary budget to account for that. We think that's going to be somewhere around $1 million. We also have, again, some additional AFD overtime based on trend and some of the holiday additions that we made this year. The employer health insurance, we haven't increased our contribution, the employer contribution to the health insurance plan in about 5 or 6 years. We do think we need what I would call a modest increase there next year of around 5%. And then finally, we're still, as staff and a management team, looking at compensation adjustments for employees next year. Obviously, with inflation up, a lot of local governments are looking at increases that are kind of above what they have been doing in recent years. And we're still evaluating what we're going to be able to afford. We're trying to be as aggressive as we can around that, knowing that employees are seeing inflation impact their pocketbooks. So that last line is really just to kind of give you all an idea. So at each 1% adjustment in the general fund, so it costs about $740,000. And so if we did a 3% increase, for example, across the board for all employees next year, that would cost approximately $2.2 million. So again, we're a very personnel-heavy driven organization, and so when we make salary increases, it does cost a fair amount in the general fund.
May I ask you a question?
Sure.
So, overtime in general, why do we have so much overtime in general? This is just a management question. I mean, I understand why overtime exists, but why is it so much? Is this, and speaking with like percentages of general fund, why are we so over? Are we poorly planning? Is this typical? Millions and millions in overtime?
Yeah, I think I would say that's particularly in APD.
So it's just, I knew in APD, like you explained, the vacancies, so you're having to pull officers, they're working overtime. But does the fire department have that many vacancies? Is that the same reason?
I'm going to add.
I see Scott on his way up. I'll let him
I'm just
jump
trying to
in on that.
understand. Well, the increase is the 1.9 million additional overtime, suggesting there's already other overtime. Go ahead.
Yeah, so our employees are scheduled, as you know, already to work 3 hours every single week of overtime. That's a very big part of that. So, correct. So firefighters after 53 hours a week are paid overtime, and they're scheduled to work 56 hours every single week. And so with a 3-shift system that we have, that is the common schedule for fire departments that use a 3-shift system. We could go to a 4-shift system and eliminate that. That obviously adds additional personnel, but that would eliminate that overtime. Another big driver this year were the amazing new benefits that council approved, the 2 new holidays, as well as the paid parental leave.
Interesting. Okay, that explains a lot. Thanks.
Okay.
So just
Esther, this is Gwen.
Go ahead.
Can I ask, so for the APD, the $1,125,000, can you, and you may not have this available right now, but can you split that up between I'm hoping that APD won't have to be working as much overtime, but can you split it up for me, reduction in overtime versus increase in hiring and personnel? You don't have to do it today, but just maybe provide that down the road. I think this would be really good news for APD because I know they've been doing a ton of overtime time this past year, and hopefully this will help alleviate a little bit of that burden.
Yeah, I'd be happy to provide that information for you all.
Hi, Sandra. I just want to ask you a question. I know you were saying that the retirement contribution fund that the state has required that you all increase it every year. Does those retirement funds actually go back to future, either people that retired in the future? Are they actually taken in consideration with those funds?
So it goes to fund the system, I guess, is maybe the easiest way to answer that. So the state manages that program for local government employees, state employees, and they do actuarial studies to determine the amount of money that they need contributed in each year in order to pay for not only current retirees but also future retirees as well. And so they adjust the rates based off of that. They haven't. Luckily, they haven't over this time period that they've been adjusting employer contributions. They've not adjusted employee contributions, and so the good news is that hasn't affected our employees in terms of more money coming out of their pockets.
And the reason I'm asking that is I had a resident actually approached me and said that they worked for the city and hadn't had any raises in over 10 years. So in their retirement, money coming in, and I was just wondering, does it spill over for them, or?
Yeah, so we've heard that before as well, and so the cost of living adjustments in that system are determined by the state, and I think they've not approved, as far as I'm aware, any cost or any adjustments, cost of living adjustments in a number of years. I think they may have been considering one either for this fiscal year or last, but yeah, that's one of the downsides of the retirement system, is that the state has typically not been increasing that amount year over year.
And I think the tension point, though, is if the state does increase retiree pay, the state turns around and asks the local
Yes.
governments for the money. So one of the criticisms, for example, of the League of Municipalities that represents all 524 cities in the state of North Carolina, it's 500 and something, I don't remember, it's 500, is that it advocates against state employee retiree pay increases. And they do that because of this problem, because the state just turns around and says, now give us the money to pay the increases to retirees of the state system. And so city employees are in that retirement system, county employees are in that retirement system, but so are all the teachers, so are all
So
the,
it didn't really-
I don't know how many retirees there are in the system now, but it's gotta be in the hundreds of thousands, I think.
Yeah, I have no idea.
It's a lot. It's a lot of people. So that's the tension point with this structure. They always tell us how well-funded North Carolina's retirement system is compared to other states, which it is, except somehow we have to keep writing the check every year. So
And one other question, Tony, how does, when you were saying 61% of our fund actually goes to personnel, how does that sort of stack up against the other cities or
That's-
municipalities in the area?
Yeah, that's very common, especially in the general fund, because most cities fund police and fire through the general fund, and again, those are very personnel-intensive services, and so most cities have a personnel cost somewhere around that 60% level.
Okay, thank you.
Can I just make sure I understood the insurance and the employer question? So the employee that retired 10 years ago that Sandra was talking about isn't getting an increase in their retirement payout, and if they were to get it, it would mean that it would likely come back around to us for an additional number.
right.
Okay, I just want to make sure I got that. Okay.
Well, unless the state, now, to be clear, the state could choose to fund it in other ways. And they have significant surplus this year, but they're not, I don't believe they're choosing to do that. And maybe we should add that to our
So
legislative agenda.
So that's what I was gonna say is, when we see the legislative agenda get finalized, could we advocate to the League of Municipalities in support of a cost of living for local government retirees from the state surplus?
That's what I was, yeah, that's exactly right.
Yeah, I think that would make a lot of
Yeah,
a
that's
lot of
what I
sense.
was-
And while we're at it, teacher pay.
I have a second request for the governance committee to consider, or for this full body to consider, is that maybe a % of a department budget change would trigger sending information to council. I don't know if that needs to be 2%, 3%, 5%. it might just provide an extra layer of communication and transparency for us and for the public as we're distilling these important decisions. And so that we can do things like celebrate when we're able to make capital improvement investments that we very much need to make, instead of wondering how this happened.
Can you clarify that question? I don't know if I understand what
Sure.
you're asking.
So if there's going to be a departmental budget change, and it wouldn't necessarily have to come to council because the budget had already been approved and you're moving things in between, if it's a percentage of the budget, say $1 million, but it might be different for each department.
And when
But-
you say a change, are you saying?
Unanticipated
a-
expenditures or unanticipated deficits. If there's going to be a significant, for example, if we were a business as usual year 4 or 5 years ago, and we were gonna have a $800,000 parking fiasco, which I would have loved for us to let everyone know that local workers should park downtown for free because we weren't gonna be charging. But here we are today. If we're gonna see that big of a deficit, it could have dramatically impacted service because we would have already made service commitments. So if there's gonna be a percentage up or down, that it would trigger communication to council instead of us finding out once it's kind of too late to do anything about it or support changes or just really to know.
And so since this issue has come up before our discussion of transit, let me just go on record of saying that that information rests solely on me, right? I own that. Should have communicated. We have made internal changes to make sure that in the future, that information is communicated to me ASAP, and we will communicate to council as soon as possible as well. But I own that.
I appreciate that, and I also just wonder if operationalizing it shares the burden of responsibility with this body, so that it doesn't just fall on one person.
I just wonder, I know so often you don't have a picture yet until it's already passed and you're looking back on it. So because of the large cash flow situation, I'm wondering what would be possible in terms of making that a policy point. Like, how would you, I'm not saying I'm asking this somewhat rhetorically. So if we were to ask for a recommendation to put something like this in place, what would that look like? So, because I get what you're.
Exactly, like if we're seeing a change and it's like, oh, this is getting ready to be 2% or 5% of this department's budget, that's a pretty big conversation to have. Let's bring it to council.
Right.
And it may be expenses, not percent of budget.
Well, and that's where I think we would
fair,
look for your guidance
Kim?
to come up with a way to.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's why I'm asking you
word
to
it.
start the conversation.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I will add, I mean, we very infrequently do budget revisions at a staff level that move money from one department to another. Most of the movement is within the department, so Scott may need more in training instead of supplies, and we do those kinds of revisions regularly, but it's rare that we take money out of a fire department budget and move it to police or another budget. And in the fleet example, again, that money was not allocated really to a department to start the year. It was only after the plan was developed that the money was kind of put in fire, it was put in police, et cetera, so.
Well, I mean, so maybe, I think I get the gist of what you're getting at, though, is if we are seeing an unexpected revenue shortfall somewhere,
Correct.
or if we're seeing an unexpected amount of vacancies resulting in a larger, we're kind of off our mark in terms of personnel costs, or if the money's already been voted on by council for certain capital projects, but they're sizable, so we want to know about them. They're coming down, we're ready to pull the trigger on $2.1 million for this sidewalk project, or the purchase of this vehicle, or whatever. Like, I kind of hear what you're saying, that so we're in the loop on those things
Because
actually
increased
happening.
transparency results in shared responsibility and shared celebration when we're getting it right.
And accountability.
Yes.
Absolutely. All right, well, I think, unless there's further questions, I'm going to turn the rest of the presentation over to Taylor Floyd. Thank you all.
Taylor, you got 14 minutes. No, I'm just.
I can talk fast. All right, good afternoon, Mayor and Council. This section here on the proposed fees and charges, we're just going to kind of hit the highlights of what we presented to the Finance and Human Resources Committee on, I think it was March 22nd when we went to them. We'll be back with you all at your next meeting on April 26th for approval. But we just wanted to make a few mention of a few items. That committee did recommend most of the proposed fee changes with a 3-0 vote, including changes to water, stormwater, solid waste, and then really a variety of other much smaller changes. But those 3 that I mentioned previously are definitely the ones that impact the most people in our community. Also wanted to mention that there were some additional changes to event application fees and rental fees for Pack Square Park that were recommended, but those were recommended on a 2-to-1 vote. So again, not going to go into a lot of detail on those unless there are any questions right now. Like I said, we'll be bringing those to you all shortly. But did want to make mention again of those 3 that have the kind of community-wide impact. This is what we think the average household impact of those changes will be for each one of those 3 fee changes that I mentioned. Solid waste is just a $2 increase monthly, so $4 for that bi-monthly bill that everyone gets. Tier 2 is where most of the single-family homes are in the stormwater fees, so you can see that increase. And then the water increases both to the base fee and the volumetric fees, but we kind of use that 6 CCFs per month as an average usage. So again, altogether, that's $10.45 for each bi-monthly bill or $62.70 annually. All right, and then just to wrap that up, again, we'll bring a presentation of proposed changes at your regular meeting on April 26th. Additional revenues from any adopted fee changes we will incorporate into the proposed budget, and those changes will be effective on July 1st. Any questions about fees and charges before I move on?
No, but I'll share that I was the vote that did not support the change in event fees, and I'm happy to talk with anyone about it.
All right, on to the fun part. So a quick update on the parking fund. We're going to start there and then transition into transit. So a few things just before we kind of get into the numbers. One, we budgeted the current year assuming that the parking fund overall would be kind of back to normal operations. That has turned out to not be the case in a variety of factors, which we'll get into a little bit. One of those is that the old gating equipment in the parking garages was well beyond its end of life and was already experiencing some intermittent failures starting back in 2020. The new equipment, replacement equipment, was installed in November 2021, and shortly after that, we started to see some intermittent operability. And that, I think, was traced back to some software and firewall issues between the vendor and the city. Those issues have mostly been resolved, and that equipment is mostly operational as of March 2022. So we provided this information to you all in a memo, but wanted to kind of bring it up here and kind of walk through it a little bit. Just really a comparison of the history in the parking fund so you can kind of get a better sense of what I would say sort of normal and where we've been over the last few years. So July to March actuals, that's actual revenue that we've received. And again, this is just parking garages. Over the last few years, you can see a pretty substantial dip in the current year and last year. Year-end actuals, again, kind of similarly, you can start to see that there was a significant drop in FY 19-20, again, as COVID started going all the way through to today, and we provided kind of a range for this year since we still have a few more months, and the historical data that we have for the current year isn't exceptionally useful, again, because of some of those intermittent operability. The budget, again, you can see the 21-22, the current year budget is similar to 18-19, so again, kind of assuming that back to normal operations. And then the difference there, and again, an estimate for the current year is that we will be between 2.25 million and 2.65 million under our budget on parking garage revenues.
So we were assuming that we were gonna be up and running.
Correct. So kind of looking back to just the current year, looking kind of at budget to actuals here, and I'll point out a few things. Again, that first line, the garages, just kind of talked about that and where we think that's going to end up. You can see kind of the total on the revenue side is pretty substantially under what we had budgeted in the parking fund overall. And then, kind of leading into the transit discussion, if we assume that that transfer, the parking fund subsidy of the transit fund, we do not make that transfer, their actual expense to revenues, kind of getting back to the fund balance conversation that Tony was having earlier, look like they're going to end up pretty close to each other. And a lot of that is related to, again, that reduction in the revenues, but also they've been really struggling with staffing there, so they have quite a bit of vacancy savings, and they have some operational things they just haven't been able to get to, maintenance and stuff like that, even credit card merchant fees that, again, from not charging, we haven't had to pay. So that's what some of that savings on the expense side is.
I have a question.
Sure.
I don't have a light, sorry. The 1.2 million from the ARPA monies that we already gave to parking fund, that was in the fiscal year 2021, right?
So,
And then, but I see that our budget was off by 1.2 million also the year before. What did we do that year?
so anytime, again, that we would have revenues that come in under expenses, that's when you would eat into the
And
fund
that's what we
balance.
did,
Correct.
okay. And I am correct in that the 1.2 was for the fiscal year 2021, right?
It's 1.6.
It was 1.6, you're right, yes.
Okay. That actually hit in the current year because that's when we got the money, but we took it out of these numbers because that would just make it a lot more confusing.
But now we're showing 2.5-ish million, not 800,000, which is what I heard first.
Wait, show me where you're looking here.
Previous slide.
Oh, okay, okay. So
Sorry.
you point at your computer and I'm
Oh,
like, what
yeah.
are you talking about? Okay.
Well, I'm trying to make sure I understand
Yeah,
because,
I got you. We
this
just
is
needed the right slide here.
yeah.
Okay, do it again with the screen.
Are-
Yeah.
I mean, so I'm looking across the years. I'm seeing in fiscal year 1920, we didn't make budget. I didn't know what happened. It sounds like it came off the general fund. Then 2021, again, but we did 1.2 million, or 1.6. And then this year now, we're coming up and we're expecting 2.5 million. But what we know about those actuals up top is that in 2020, we just turned off parking decks because of the pandemic. So that 1.35, or no, I'm sorry, 2021. The 1.35 million we know is just a fluke because we weren't charging as much, right? But we're not expecting that to recover? Because now we're saying next year we're planning for 1.34.
Hey,
That's
Sage,
this year.
for us who can't do this financial stuff at lightning speed, can we break this down? Where is the ARPA transfer reflected in this slide?
It is not.
Okay,
So-
there we go.
So,
All
and
right,
also, I want to make a
okay,
few,
Thank you.
a few
Okay.
points.
So this isn't looking to next year. This is all history.
Correct.
Okay, so we haven't, the transfer's not gonna show up yet because,
You're talking about the ARPA funding. Yeah, we took it out because I think it complicates the picture.
so Gwen, it's not, so it's there, it's just not shown in this slide. We're not talking about the ARPA decision coming up that council has yet to allocate. We're talking about funds already
Correct.
moved.
And
And that totaled how much?
1.6.
6. And it would, if we were to put it here, it would show up in 2021, 20, I'm sorry, 20, would
It would show up in
21,
22.
22.
And then that number would say 1 million,
Right.
and then that's how we're at 800 to a million.
So I do want to say a couple things. One, this slide is just parking garage. So this is not the whole parking fund. So that's
Okay.
why, and I'd have to go back and double check, but I don't believe that the parking fund was in a deficit, certainly not in 1819 and potentially not
Okay.
in 1920 overall.
So this isn't reflective of the entire parking.
Correct.
enterprise
Correct.
fund.
And the other thing I do want to mention too that has impacted, starting from COVID is not just, certainly the having the decks free for several months was a significant impact, but another big impact that they've seen is on the monthly parking. As most of us, that work in City Hall have only fairly recently come back to the building. That's been the case, I think, for a lot of other folks. So a lot of our monthly parkers, are not paying for those fees because they don't have people coming into the office. And I think that's potentially going to continue on into, next year and beyond.
Are we freeing up those spaces for other people to grab them then? Or they're just saying, we're not downtown, but we still want them, but we're not going to pay you?
I mean, if they're paying for them, we'll certainly take that monthly rate. They don't, in
I know, I'm
Canada,
sorry,
fees
and
coming
this
up
is
here.
actually matters to the workforce, because for a long time, we had like hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of wait lists to get into a deck. Hi, Ken. And then during COVID, we suddenly had spaces, so we were telling everybody that lived downtown, go grab a space, but
Right, and that's correct. What we're trying to do is fill those spaces up. One of the transitions we've made in the past, we kept up with our waiting list with just a spreadsheet. And we've changed to a better way. And it's just with our staff limitations, we're having a hard time keeping up with it. So we're trying to contact folks as often as we can, and we are signing new people up.
so we have some vacancies in our downtown parking decks that area businesses and residents could grab?
Well, yes, but we still have to go through our list. So like,
Sure.
for example, and I'll just kind of make up a number, for Harrah's, there could still be on paper from the old spreadsheet, there could still be 100 on the waiting list. We got to go through those, contact them to see if they're still interested before we can say, here's a new person that could fit in. That's what takes the time. One other thing I'd say is, you remember we had to change the hourly rate to $2, from $1.25 to $2 with the new equipment. And at the same time, we made the first hour free for everybody. What we've seen so far is the average stay in the garage now is less than 2 hours. So that means for that 2-hour block, we're getting $2. And the average stay before COVID was somewhere between 2 and 3 hours, and we would be able to collect $3.75 because the first hour was only free for the first hour.
Ken, may I ask you a question?
Sure.
How many parking spaces are set aside for residents or businesses?
We don't have that breakdown. We look at each garage to see how many monthly accounts that we could have in there. We have roughly 1,500 spaces in all our garages. And we try to keep a balance of that, so it kind of fluctuates that where we have, but we don't say that it has to be a resident or has to be an employee or has to be a business. It's really first come, first serve if you want a monthly account.
Yeah, I was just wondering if you had a percentage of how many, you actually sort of had, so you know how many parking spaces are for the public use, as opposed to not people leasing them.
Right.
Yeah.
We do have those numbers, and we could get those for you as far as what the hourly parkers are compared to the total numbers of the monthly parkers.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Ken. Any other questions before we move on? I do want to point out one more thing before I leave this slide. We left on this debt number primarily because we've heard, and actually I was at a community meeting several weeks ago. Some folks asked some questions about paying the Biltmore parking deck debt off early. And I just want to say to you all that was not ever a plan, nor have we made any additional payments above and beyond what the principal and interest is required to for those debt payments. So I just want to make that clear, because we've heard that a few times, and want to make sure that you all are aware that is not something that we have done.
Yeah, that came up in parking committee time and time again for downtown. That's where that comes from.
Okay.
No, it was told to us. It was Kathy. She shared that, I think, so the parking committee was a subcommittee of the Downtown Commission. It's kind of defunct right now. We brought it back for a few years in like 2017 for some of these reasons, upgrading meters and helping. if I recall, we learned that parking debt can be built with some of the longest amortization schedules, 40 years on the debt. And despite that, we were still targeting paying it off in 10. That's what we remember from the meeting. And I think we've since followed up and learned that wasn't accurate. So I'm just taking a moment to say that wasn't accurate, but that was from a previous meeting. It sounds like the rumor's still out.
Yep, thank you. So to kind of summarize and transition over to the transit side, per state law, the parking fund has to cover parking-related expenses before any of those revenues can be used for other services. Again, in the current year, we budgeted a $1.5 million subsidy from the parking fund to transit. We don't think that the parking fund revenues are going to support making that transfer. And again, we're continuing to look as with the equipment being active and operational, hopefully we'll have a better sense of kind of where our budget should be for next year. And that will obviously inform what capacity the parking fund has to continue its support of the transit fund. So if there aren't any more questions about that, I will transition then into transit. So as I'm sure you all are aware.
Taylor?
Yes.
Taylor, this is Gwen. I'm sorry. Are we, and this probably isn't your question as much as to Deborah or to Ken, but have we done kind of an after action analysis of what happened with the change for the what happened when we transitioned to the new software and the new system? I mean, I'm not trying to be derogatory, but it's pretty big error, and I'm just wondering, if we've done kind of an after action and tried to figure out sort of what happened and how it's never going to happen again.
Well, I can say it may happen again, Gwen, but it will not happen and you not know about it. But I'm going to ask Ken if he can talk about the team that's been organized to do a thorough look at what happened, why it happened, and that we will try our best not to have it happen again, at least with this duration of time.
Yeah, that's correct. We were working closely with, we're still working closely with our IT department. We're still working very closely with the vendor for flash parking, and we're working with the finance department to try to pull all this together and to make sure that we're still doing the very best we can. One of the things that we've learned that I would like to think that we would never repeat again on any contract is that when we first went out for bids and so forth, the vendors, not just this one that we picked, but they would all say, we can take care of it, we can handle your firewalls and all this. Well, what's happened in reality in this particular case, they couldn't handle the firewalls. So that was a big thing that took a while to uncover. We're still working closely with them to see if there's going to be any kind of action where they will give some of our money back. We're working on that. One of the things that's come up just recently is the fact that when we have something that may come up today, we contact their service department. Sometimes it's taken a week or more before they respond. And that's unacceptable because that means that whatever that issue might be, it can't be fixed. We're still having some supply issues where we have ordered, like, for example, extra gates, and they're just not here yet simply because of the supply chain. So what we've had to do with our team is get creative and try to fix with spare parts all the gates that we have. We do have occasionally people get impatient when they want to go through and the gate won't go up, so they decide to drive through it. But we are trying to stay on top of it, and we're going to try to make improvements almost on a daily basis.
Do we not have any kind of insurance for loss of service or anything? I mean, that's almost $1 million in lost money from that contract issue. So, I mean, there's no recovery available, huh? It's just, I don't know.
Well, probably Ken's not the right, but we
Yeah.
probably need to ask Risk, but I assume we're self-insured.
I really don't know how it works. Thank you. I have a question for Taylor when he gets there. And I don't expect you to have this today. I tried to glance through the rest of the slides.
While we have Ken here, do we have any
When,
parking decks that currently aren't charging for parking? That we know of?
No,
Okay.
we're collecting money every day in every parking garage.
Because I heard earlier that we're mostly recovered. What does it look like to be fully recovered? And what does mostly recovered mean?
I'm not sure that term. We're gonna-
Comment that Taylor made in terms of the March 2022.
Yeah, so.
Okay.
One second. So when I talked to Garrett to double check that, because I wanted to make sure that if I said we were fully operational, that was in fact the case. He said that, there are still some bugs, things that are happening, as, Ken kind of referenced, issues are still popping up with the equipment, but there's nothing, it's not like the widespread and complete, lack of operational capacity that we saw over the winter.
Got it, thanks.
my only question was that when this comes to us later, could we possibly see the historical contribution to transit from parking? I think it used to be like 500, but now it's gotten to 1.5.
Yeah, it was, I think it was around 660,000. I think we upped that 2 or 3 years ago. You think it was
It
that
was
long?
recent, okay.
So,
I
yeah.
can probably look
But
it up
we can-
myself. It was
we can
fairly
certainly
recent.
bring that
Okay,
up. Yep.
thank you.
Any other questions about parking? All right. So transit, also seeing some challenges there. Our service provider in transit is really struggling with a driver shortage. They're having to use a significant amount of overtime, utilizing supervisors and maintenance staff to just keep service on route, so to drive buses. Staff has been reviewing options in coordination with the provider to figure out how to continue to deliver service and minimize service interruptions. You all may be aware there's a reduction in frequency planned on one route, so no cuts to locations, but just lower frequency than what we had planned. And the idea there was that would be a planned service interruption that people could, would know about and could kind of figure out, rather than a random missed trip because we didn't have bus drivers. So the idea was kind of least impact and most predictability for riders. And I believe that change actually starts tomorrow. And just on the last bullet there, we are reviewing some options with the service provider to address this driver shortage. And it's likely that will have significant ongoing costs for our service. So we are not the employer of the bus drivers, but we pay an hourly rate essentially for that service. So, if that change ends up being additional pay for bus drivers, that is very likely to be passed along to us. So just a reminder, in the current year, we did plan an expansion of transit service. We allocated $1.1 million to continue implementation of the Transit Master Plan beginning in October of 2021. That included extending evening hours and some increased frequency on 2 routes.
Excuse me, Taylor, I have a question
Yes.
about our contractor. Are they a second chance employer? Do they employ
I'm not sure, Ken, do you
people
know the
with
answer
criminal
to that?
backgrounds? It seems like that might be a problem nationally when it comes to our driver shortage.
And as Ken is coming up, Vice Mayor, it is definitely a national issue in terms of driver shortages.
Yeah, I know it's a national issue, but I'm saying that it's
It's
probably
second chance.
exacerbated because they're not second chance employers. They probably have restrictions on criminal background.
For the CDL
For-
license, I don't know, but go ahead, Ken.
And I don't know the answer to that, but I can definitely find out and share it.
Because it really doesn't make sense to me with so many job openings and so many people looking for work. There has to be an issue, with why people aren't being employed. And I would just guess that their criminal background would probably be a big barrier.
Makes sense to expand the pool. So, and I guess just to be clear, I don't know if I said this or not, but we have not implemented that planned expansion from October due to the bus driver shortage. So kind of looking similarly in the current year transit budget, looking at kind of budget to where we think they're going to end the year. So again, that first highlighted line, that's the parking support of the transit fund. We're making an assumption that that is not going to happen in the current year. And then you can see on the expense side that we are anticipating some savings a little bit from operations and city administration, just from some staffing shortages there on the city side. And then also, again, because our service provider, RATP Dev, is not providing that expanded service, we are not paying for those new revenue hours, as they're called. So there's a reduction there. And then on the paratransit side, I think that has just purely been reflective of fewer, just lower trip volume there. Those are kind of calls for service. So ultimately, kind of where that looks, if you look at the year-end estimate, revenues to expenses, it looks like, again, actuals are going to end pretty close. Again, really kind of that lack of the parking subsidy netting out on the expense side with those reductions in the expenditures.
Okay, where's the 1.6 million ARPA? I see 1 million.
So that 1 million in ARPA was transit-specific ARPA money that we budgeted in the transit fund for this year. So we're assuming that we will utilize that in the current year, and there's I think a total of 1.8 million that was available, that was allocated to the city of Asheville. Again, transit only ARPA, right? Separate.
So the 1.6 is going to show up in the parking.
Correct.
Okay.
Not
This
here.
was a
Not
completely
here.
separate
This is the
$1
total.
million.
Yeah, this was
Correct.
just for transit.
Thank you.
And likely that transit ARPA money is a source that we could look to if, in fact, revenues do come in under expenditures to kind of balance that in the current year if we need to do that.
I submitted some questions about this, but I wonder if, when we look at the budget versus year-end estimate for RATP Dev and the difference between the 10.2 million and the 9.3 million, is this the number of the routes we didn't run and why we didn't pay for them?
Essentially, yes.
Okay, so a follow-up that I have for this one is missed trips by month, which is normally a report that's given to the transit committee, so that we could see which ones didn't run. My bus didn't show up today, so I'm assuming we didn't pay for that trip. But a monthly breakdown next to the missed trips would help to see if we're having any trends.
Yeah, I think we can certainly provide that information.
And I have a few other questions that I got from Ms. Lerman.
Okay. All right, again, just kind of to summarize, likely looking to that transit-specific rescue plan funding to cover a current year gap if there is one. Again, we're working with the service provider to evaluate options to address that driver shortage in the current fiscal year. And it's going to be really challenging for us to do any expansion of service until those staffing issues with the service provider are addressed. Obviously, we got to have bus drivers to run routes.
Gwen, did you have a question?
Yes, just quickly. Didn't we also, in January, because we weren't able to produce monthly passes, didn't we lose revenue as a result of that? And we just gave people free transit service for that month. How much was that? And again, I would love to see an analysis of how that happened and that we didn't have a plan B.
We'll get that information.
Yeah, you don't mean like this second, you mean like in the future.
Right,
Right.
exactly. You don't have to, but I would like to know how much of lost revenue we had, and again, kind of I know this is a bad expression for it, but an after-action report.
Sure.
I will say in general that the fares are a very small overall portion of or a small portion of the overall revenue in the transit fund.
But this again is a third-party provider that we contracted with that didn't supply the services or needed items to enact our contract on time, right? This was the card provider, did not send the cards in time. And with the parking deck, it was the new provider, didn't understand firewalls, right? It's so interesting that, well, I heard them say that it was them. So I just wonder, you know, the loss of funds for both of these things, who's really ultimately responsible financially?
Well, you know, I mean, I think we could make sure that legal's taking a look at those contracts, and if there are any recourse, fully take advantage and exhaust any kind of recourse. And if there's not, maybe going forward, look for opportunities to add provisions that do protect us, since, you know, I think historically, failures like this were not necessarily anticipated, and now they're kind of our new normal. But, you know, I don't know if there is a way to better protect ourselves against some of these
And
issues.
Mayor, I have asked the city attorney's office to look into this. As Ken said, we are negotiating with the vendor. There are, again, some operational communication issues that need to be enhanced, and we're working on those as well.
I have asked for the, if we can get the most recent transit contract sent to all of council so we can review it if we need to. Also, when the contract is up for reconsideration. Thank you.
All right, if there aren't any other questions, I think I'm going to turn it over to Jade Dundas to talk about Memorial Stadium.
Taylor. Jade, good afternoon, Mayor, members of council. Jade Dundas, Capital Projects Director. I've just got a couple of slides here. Okay. So on March 22nd, council authorized the city manager to move forward with the consideration of very specific scope items for Memorial Stadium's continued phases of work. And also instructed to identify funding for those scope items. Those scope items included a 6-lane competitive track, and the exhibits were provided to give those dimensions, and then also various other scope items. The main scope items, there are other incidental scope items here, for example, a retaining wall for the northwest corner of the track, but the main scope items for this project are provided in this graphic. Again, the same graphic used in the previous presentation. 400-meter, 6-lane competitive rubber surface track, reduced, largest marked field is 65 by 120 yards. Replace existing restroom and create additional space for equipment storage to support the activities on the field and the track. Replace the western bleachers with concrete plaza to allow temporary seating. Paved asphalt walking trail, as indicated in the yellow path here, and then also playground improvements. The estimated cost of these improvements were in the general area of about $4.4 million. Staff was instructed to go identify funds for this project, and this is how we have strategized to fund this project. $2.5 million would be ARPA funding. $944,000 is the remaining balance in the that was approved in the 2016 GO bond. CIP contingency of $750,000. That fund is set aside every year in our capital budget to cover unexpected expenses, cost overruns on projects, so on and so forth. This year it hasn't been used, and so that is a fund that we're suggesting to be used. And then unspent fleet replacement funds. Again, this is similar to the conversation before. There is a balance in our fleet replacement funds for various reasons, but there is a opportunity to take $148,345. That's a very specific number because that basically covers our estimate of the $4.342 million. So to move forward, we're next council meeting, we will bring a design contract for the ability to move, to have council authorize us to, on this scope, to move forward with this project. We will also bring a budget amendment that will ask for the $2.5 million to be amended from the ARPA funding into a capital budget. The remaining of these funds, as discussed previously, will be, again notifying council in this presentation, but they will be moved into this budget to cover the cost of the project. The one item that we're very focused on right now is the $944,000. As we've talked previously, there is a deadline for the expenditure of these funds, and we're going to do everything we can to, now that we have the scope, to get the design done and have this project bid by next summer, so we can get moving forward on the construction of this, encumbrance of the funds, and issuance of the bond for this balance. And that's concludes the Memorial Stadium portion of this presentation.
I had a question around the CIP contingency. Uh-oh. Okay. Okay. All right. What other contingency might that have already been earmarked for? Let me just answer this.
Sure.
Am I supposed to put on speaker? Do I put on speaker?
Sorry, the phone just disconnected.
Okay, you're back on. Okay, you're good.
Sorry.
Okay.
So the question is what would be the contingency earmarked for? That is very specifically a contingency, and so if it is not programmed at the beginning of the year for any specific use, and throughout the year, if we have an overage in a project and we need to
I know.
on that.
I know what CIP. I'm just trying to make sure. Sometimes we get presented with an idea and then we make a decision, and then a few months later, I'll hear somebody say, "Well, we would have, built that sidewalk, except you spent the CIP contingency on." So, is there something else? I'm just asking you. Or is it truly just unallocated contingency funding? There's nothing else needed. There's not another project sitting out there that's not going to happen because we're about to allocate this money to Memorial.
So as we've discussed in recent presentations about capital, it's all about the prioritization, and there's always the next project.
There's
to be able to
always more
fund.
capital
Yeah,
projects. I
yeah.
understand that. I just want to make sure there's not.
But this has not been dedicated
Yeah,
to
okay.
any particular project.
Thanks.
So knowing that we have 944 in the bonds, we dedicated already, we can get started, and now we're about to face a new budget cycle, could we not plan for the CIP contingency that we automatically budget for every year to also be in here? Could we not say that 2022, fiscal year 22, 23, 750 would be in here?
Then it wouldn't be a contingency fund.
Well, then it'd be a planned fund, but my point is, I'm concerned personally about using rescue plan dollars for this. I support the track and all on, and I knew that this ask was coming, but I am wondering if there are other funds instead of ARPA, because I'm having a hard time personally tying rescue funds to this spending.
But you're saying.
I'm saying we've got $750 a year that we
No, well, no,
automatically
but
put in
aren't you-
CIP for
you're saying-
contingency. So can we use?
Sage, I think he's saying this contingency funding is for this
Right.
year.
And
We
I'm saying,
didn't
can we
use
grab
it.
next year's too?
Well, but the point of a contingency fund is while you're in the year,
In
you're
case something
doing
goes
your
wrong.
capital work and you develop a contingency. Well, now we're ending this year and they're saying, well, we didn't have the contingency, so
Yeah.
we can allocate these resources. We don't know that for next year.
I understand.
But I think your bigger point, which is, hey, is there another way to fund this other than using ARPA funds? Let's ask that question.
We could certainly look at other strategies. This is the recommendation that we moved forward with was the $2.5 million, and so we developed a strategy around that. We could certainly look at other.
There are other
ideas.
options, but they will impact other projects. This is the opportunity to have a one-time funding opportunity for us without having a significant impact on other projects.
Well,
That's why we
What
were
about
recommending.
so wait, Gwen, you've got a question?
I'm sorry. But to Sage's point, I thought that we verified that this is a valid use of ARPA funds. It may not be Sage's preference, but it's
Right.
That is correct.
allowed
Oh, yeah.
under the
It
law.
is.
No,
I mean,
I-
I guess I just wanted to clarify that
Yeah.
before we kind of moved away from that.
And-
Yeah, I didn't mean to insinuate that it wasn't an allowable use under the
is an allowable
definitions.
use.
It's maybe
Well-
more of a personal thing, but assumed you did determine it was an allowable.
Yes. they do. What
Yes.
about
Yes.
debt financing it? What about our lobs and sobs?
And
Is-
timeline was going to be my final question. Like, are we trying to do this all right now because the whole project has to be done in one phase? Or are there, we
The-
never said this needs to happen in 3 months. I just am curious what that thinking is.
We were moving forward with the scope that was identified, and tasked with finding sources of funding for that. Like I said, we believe this is the 2.5 million ARPA funding version. There are potential other options out there.
I think Sage is asking, sorry, I'm like, just drives me crazy. Are we gonna have to spend it all next year? Or do we have another fiscal year to run into where we could find the money?
We have to have the bond portion of this money
Yes,
spent.
that part, but the whole 4.4, are you anticipating project completion by summer 2023? So we need to have this money identified, and I see that
we have to have
the
it,
time is
yeah.
gonna jump out of.
So I guess the short answer is on the budget, yes, you have to have the full project budget identified. Now, all of the, let me see if I can go back to the, so on this slide, all of these sources, except for ARPA, the other three sources are debt funded. So we'll work that into our cash flows and that we're gonna issue debt for. But yeah, so yeah, we need to adopt the full budget at the start of the project, but then the cash will go out over the 12 or 18 months, whatever the construction timeline is. Did that help answer the question?
Yeah, both of the questions about
And
the
ti-
debt funding. I mean,
Yeah.
could we borrow to fund the remaining 2.5 as well?
Yeah, kind of back to the, Jade's point and Deborah Campbell's as well. I mean, we can look at other strategies. They're all going to involve debt. And so it's either going to be taking debt that we were going to use for other projects, or layering on additional debt, which right now, based on what I'm hearing from our financial advisors, we really don't have a lot of capacity to add a lot of additional debt right now.
I'm gonna translate that you would not recommend it.
And also, Tony, and I was thinking, if you did not, the reason you have this fixed cost here is because you're taking in consideration actual cost to actually, get it up and running. So if we extend it out, that cost could actually exceed that number because of the cost of material and the issues. Would that be impacted by that if we actually did not, Deb, okay.
Yeah, potentially. I assume that there is some contingency built into the number, but yeah, there's obviously, the longer you delay projects,
The more it's
you
gonna
run a
cost.
risk of it running
Yeah.
higher.
And we feel good about this $4.3 million estimate. I know we got it out pretty quick. Was this just ballparks? Did we actually go to bid? I mean, we didn't design
No,
it.
This is an estimate that's based upon the estimate provided by the designer on the track, and they've also provided information on the restroom replacement, and then also some in-house work here with regard to design costs and the fees for providing the equipment and so on and so forth. So we are comfortable with this estimate.
But we'll still go through an RFP process and.
Yeah, yes, we have been through an RFP process. We're negotiating with the designer right now, and that is the contract that
Oh,
will be brought to
okay.
council on the 26th.
Okay.
And just a reminder, it's not like this particular project got accelerated, it got redesigned. We were already on track, no pun intended, to move this project. And as we were going through the process, then the scope was broadened. And so now we are just continuing on the path that we were on with a broader scope of the project. That's all this is about. And the issue is, where does the funding come from? Because we have expanded the scope of the project. And we looked at how do we have the minimal impact on existing projects And so that's why we said, there is a funding source out there that this particular project would qualify for. And that's why we're recommending the 2.5 from ARPA.
Also, because it's not clear there's another source of funding. I mean, I would, yeah.
And then you keep kicking the can down the road, you're back to your priority.
So I have another question around this. First of all, we missed an opportunity. Instead of using the bond funds for this, we purchased new park facilities in South Asheville. That being in the
Now,
past.
that was always earmarked
Sure,
at the beginning.
But there's bond funds now, so I'm just saying, we've already missed an opportunity. And if we say that we're gonna use $2.5 million in ARPA funds, and that's not gonna be competing against other projects, it does compete with all the other ARPA applications. So I wonder what other options aren't we seeing? I understand that it may mean we don't get to do something else internally, but I think we need to make that choice with all the information available. So if we were to fund this with debt financing or with the general fund balance or with other funds internally, what would not get done? Because the ARPA funds mean something's not gonna get done too. And it would be a community-led application.
Is that something that someone can answer right now, or is that, is that kind of more?
I would
mean, is
imagine
that
the
more of a question
future-
to council? Because
It's-
we have the list of
Yeah, I was gonna
applicants for the ARPA funding, so we'd kind of know what.
But we also, I mean, it probably would need to be in the next budget work session to be like, well, here's a proposed funding source number one, proposed funding source number two, not ARPA funds.
I think what staff is saying is there's not other funds.
But I heard that we could do it with other funds, but something else wouldn't get done.
So you want to say again, Tony, explain again what you said about what other funding sources are available besides using ARPA for the 2.5? You said it would be debt, but tell us again about how that would displace other projects.
Sure, yeah, I mean, it's gonna be debt either way. Again, all three of those funding sources for the current plan, other than the ARPA, are debt financed budget numbers. And again, the other options, if we're gonna have to find an additional money other than the 2.5, it would be looking at existing projects that we have, because what I've been hearing from our financial advisors is we don't have the capacity right now to take on any additional debt above and beyond what we already have budgeted over the next 5 years in our CIP. So it would be looking to reprioritize existing spending that's already part of the budget.
Which includes ... Like, what is that?
It would be our list of capital.
Yes.
Yes, it's our list of capital. So
Right, that's the decision I'm saying that we have to make. This body has to make.
if we use
We're not willing.
ARPA funds and offset other
Yes.
ARPA asks, or shift this over to capital and displace something in the capital pipeline.
Well,
Yes?
Esther, don't we typically approve our capital funding and look at our 5-year plan in connection with our budget? So wouldn't that naturally happen anyway? And so wouldn't we just be looking at, if Council Member Roney wants to propose that we take something off of the next year's capital, then that would be a decision we would make in the budget. So this is consistent with our budget process, I would think.
Yep, yes, in the sense that we always do look at the capital budget as well. Would we want to ask staff, if we said to staff, look, can you tell us how to get this 2.5 million out of the capital side or the debt side? If you had to shift those funds and displace something, could you give us kind of a menu of options of what that looks like? I don't
would
know if we
support
want to
that.
go through that painful exercise. Do we want to go through that painful exercise?
I would support that.
I for one would not be supportive of that exercise.
Okay, yeah, it'll be somewhat gruesome,
I don't know how gruesome or thorough it need to be, but I think to Councilwoman Roney's point, if there were a menu of things that we said, okay, well, these are the capital improvement plans for this upcoming year, and I'd like to be able to see them and weigh them. I think that's all Ms. Roney is saying as well.
But it will be in our capital, when you approve the budget, you look at the capital, the 5-year capital, and you'll look at next year's capital plan, and if you think that there's something that's $2.5 million that could be swapped out, then that's the decision we as a council will make.
Right.
Will make in connection with the budget. But I think staff has basically said we've looked at other options, we've tried to figure it out, and this is their best estimate.
Yeah.
So or this is their best source, and if we disagree with that, we will have to do that in connection with the budget. But I feel like they've already gone through the process of identifying sources, but I could be wrong.
We have, and again, my instructions, well, you all's instructions to me was to go and look at funding sources. That's exactly what we did, and this is our recommendation. If you want us to go back and relook at and provide you with some different alternatives,
Well,
we
I do
certainly
have a
can do that.
question. I'm wondering, because there seems to be some hesitancy with using ARPA funds, I'm just wondering what proposed ideas do council members find to be more important than the health and welfare of a community that's waited 30-plus years for this opportunity, since we have an opportunity that would not delve into the taxpayers' pockets? Which applications do we feel are more worthy than the request of an historic Black neighborhood? Portaloos?
And also, adding to Antoinette, this project pretty much should have been finished years ago. So if you take that in consideration and where we are now, I think the sooner that we get it funded and completed, it's better for all involved. Because
And my question was not rhetorical. Which ones matter more?
Yeah.
Well, and I think to Councilwoman Kilgore's point, I agree in that this was something long overdue, not a result of the pandemic. So I don't know that, I understand your point, Councilwoman Mosley. I guess I'm just seeing it as it's similar to the parking. It was a technological failure, not a result of the pandemic. And this neighborhood clearly deserves this, and this council has spoken to wanting this track and this version of the Memorial Park. So that's great, but it also wasn't a response to the pandemic. That's all I'm trying to connect.
I disagree. The reason I first heard about it was when I was out running in the East End community, and a community member said, if only we had a track. That was during the pandemic.
Well, and
Just needing bathrooms in downtown. We needed bathrooms before the pandemic, except no one is talking about, we don't have bathrooms for tourists.
Yeah, that's a very
well, and I think somebody sent us an article and asked us to look at, there's one of our ARPA requests concerns stormwater. And someone sent us an article about what the town of Brevard is doing with their ARPA funds. And they're using their ARPA funds for long overdue infrastructure projects. They're rebuilding a bridge. I read the whole article. They're doing a stormwater project, and they're fixing their water system. Mm-hmm. And that's what a lot of communities are doing with their ARPA funds. I think because we are a regional hub for service, we provide a lot of services for folks experiencing houselessness, rent and those kinds of things. Ours was more expansive in terms of what we are anticipated to spend and have already spent our ARPA funds on, whether it was literally hotel rooms and things like that for those needing shelter. So, but I think it runs the gamut in terms of what communities, and quite frankly, I truly believe that Congress knew that they were infusing cash into communities to scale up long overdue projects, and that was very deliberate. So it was not only to provide emergency relief for the problems caused by the emergency, but it was also because America has failing infrastructure, and it needed a significant cash infusion to get us sort of caught up, but not, obviously not totally caught up. So, I mean, this is kind of more of a, I think this is more of, kind of a values discussion in it. So I recognize, I'm concerned a lot about where we are stuck financially. And, one of the things that is, that, you guys have done a great job putting together this presentation. It's not even over technically, but we're going to need to finish because we got to have a break before we go into this council meeting. But, in talking with the county, I'm very struck by the confines of our budget. So municipalities in North Carolina survive and rely mostly on property tax revenue. And we have, we're a growing city, so we do have growing property tax revenue. It's a skyrocket, but it's because we've lowered the property tax rate as values have gone up. So our property tax revenue grows, but it's not, exploding by any means. Whereas sales tax growth has exploded. And because of the way sales tax is allocated in North Carolina, cities don't get that much of it. They get a very small fraction of it. So, but the county receives a great deal. So, we're reading in the paper that the county is able to add 71 new positions. Here we're going to be struggling to make sure our existing employees get the pay raises they need to be able to afford the cost of living rise in our city and in the country. So we just have such a different pressure and confinement in terms of our revenue growth. And this is something we've studied over the years, this sort of disconnect between the rise in cost and the slow rise in revenue for cities. So, and I was actually interested in looking at that slide because even in our comparable size cities, Wilmington, Concord, we are seeing more revenue, but we obviously have a lot of expense that comes along with that. So I appreciate these challenging decisions we're trying to make as a council and work with the staff who's trying to give us the best advice they can. So I appreciate the proposal and the tough decisions we'll have to make. We will, if it would be desirable, maybe we're going to do one more budget work session on the 26th. Please tell me, it's just one more, right? I was looking at the timeline. I think it's one more. And that at that time, though, we're going to be looking at, maybe you can skip to the timeline. We're going to be doing fees and charges. But if you want to send us a reminder about that capital budget, what it looks like, just so we have some context for this decision making, that would be helpful.
I appreciate that. And I do think that Memorial Stadium upgrades and the connection to health outcomes is appropriate use of ARPA funds. I just want us to make a decision based on what the other options are for the city to fund it instead of ARPA funds. And I didn't see a comparison today. I think we could see one.
I'm also curious, and maybe it could be for the next budget session, are we intending to apply to the TPDF for some of these funds that seems like maybe qualify? And to the mayor's point about the county seeming to be in a fiscally better shape than we are we approaching them to help with our transit losses? Sometimes when I talk with various county commissioners, I do hear that there is some desire to partner with the city or help increase frequency. And I just wonder if are we approaching the county about all of this as they scale up and have funding?
Yes, we are having consistent conversations with the county as it relates to funding a lot of things. Transit, issues around homeless, affordable housing. We're having all of those conversations. Our transit issue is a labor issue. It is drivers. Even if we had the money, we couldn't do what I think we want to do because we just don't have the human resources. We will come back to you all with information about the capital budget. Again, we were asked to provide you, as you said, Mayor, our best judgment about the use of both funds from our capital general fund, and we think ARPA is an opportunity for us, because we've never had this kind of federal dollars available that we could use to invest in our own facilities, ever. And other than bond funding, but I'm saying from the federal perspective, that we have an opportunity. I mean, most other communities are doing exactly what you said. They are building roads. They are doing stormwater initiatives. I'll get off my soapbox. Thank you. We'll come back with any information you want us to come back with.
I would be curious if we'll see a draft like TPDF ask, or if that's appropriate that this council might even see it. I know
And-
that period's coming.
And for TPDF, we actually just had a meeting this morning to discuss proposals. It's not like we don't have enough capital items. We just don't have enough money. ARPA is an opportunity for us.
I mean, I definitely think it's worth a conversation with the TDA. I do think that, and I love to use the word tension, but another tension point around this project and the Tourism Development Authority is that right now their money has to be, if it's going to be used for capital, it has to be used to increase heads and beds. And I think that what I'm hearing the conversation is around Memorial is walking that fine line of maintaining a community park versus a regional venue. And if we're going to move more in the direction of supporting a community park, that is obviously not going to be as an attractive funding option for the Tourism Development Authority. So that's a little bit of a challenge. But again, we got a list a mile long that the TDA can fund for projects, so.
My question was, do we weigh in on that process as council?
Do you,
I don't have a light. I'm sorry, you can't tell.
yeah, so we don't have a hard and fast process for that. I think,
We will this time, Mayor.
But we
will
will- yeah.
be coming back.
take it away.
We
Yeah.
will take,
Yeah,
we
'cause
will
we
bring it
haven't in the
back
past.
to council before we go into the application phase. And we will give you in priority order our recommendations for the TPDF, whatever those acronyms are, process, the grant process.
And, you know, and I will say that process is a little bit of a funny dance because it's kind of like you're hearing from the TDA sort of what things they think would be the most successful applications. And obviously, since they make the grants, you want to know that. And then they need to hear from us what we think should be the most successful applications, and you're trying to find that meeting of the minds, so to speak. Okay, if we stop now, we have 11 minutes. Is there more things to tell us? Council, anything else? We're to the timeline. Everyone can see there that we'll have another work session on the 26th with the proposed budget being presented on May 24th, and then the required public hearing on the 14th with an adoption on the 28th, which is cutting it a little close, but since it needs to be in place by July 1. All right. Okay, we're adjourned until 10 minutes from now.